The snow had been falling since sundown, and by 9 o'clock it was coming down in sheets. Ethan Cole stood at his kitchen window with a mug of black coffee going cold in his hand, watching the white obliterate what remained of the tree line. The fence posts along the eastern pasture had disappeared an hour ago. The cattle were inside. The generator was primed. The barn doors were latched shut against a wind that had been screaming since mid-afternoon, rattling the storm shutters and pushing drafts under every door in the house. This was Montana in December, and Ethan had lived here long enough to know it, without apology. His daughter, Lily, was asleep in the back bedroom. She was 6 years old and had learned to sleep through the worst of the winter storms, though she still reached for her stuffed rabbit when the thunder snow rolled through the valley. Ethan had checked on her twice already tonight. Both times, she was still, small, breathing soft, curled beneath a quilt her grandmother had stitched together from patches of old flannel shirts. He put the coffee mug in the sink and turned off the overhead light. Outside, the storm pushed harder. He was halfway up the stairs when he heard it. Not the wind, not the cattle shifting in their stalls. Something else, a low sound near the barn, irregular, wrong. He stood on the fourth step and listened. The sound came again, a thud, or maybe something catching against the barn's outer wall, dragged by the wind. He told himself it was a loose plank. He told himself it was an animal, a deer pressing into the building for shelter, which happened more than city people would believe. He told himself these things, and then pulled on his coat anyway. He took the lantern from its hook beside the back door and stepped outside. The cold hit him like something physical. The wind drove snow horizontal across the yard, and within 3 steps he could barely see the barn. He kept the lantern low and walked with his head down, following the path his boots knew better than his eyes did. 12 steps to the gate, 8 steps across the open ground, then the bulk of the barn materializing in front of him, like something rising from the dark. He heard the sound again before he reached the doors. A voice, small, already giving up. He lifted the lantern and saw her. She was pressed against the barn doors with her back against the wood, knees half bent. One hand braced against the planking to hold herself upright. She had dark hair plastered against her face by the snow. Her coat, a good coat, expensive even, but not built for this kind of cold, was soaked through. Her boots were city boots, leather, already ruined. Her lips had gone the color of winter sky. She looked at him through the curtain of falling snow. And her eyes were the kind of eyes that had stopped expecting anything good. "I just need somewhere warm," she said. Her voice was barely sound. Ethan stood in the blowing dark and looked at her for one moment. Long enough to understand she was not a threat. Long enough to understand she was past the point of asking for charity. This was the kind of request a person made right before they stopped asking for anything. He unlatched the barn doors and pulled one open. The wind fought him for it. "Come on," he said. She moved without a word. Inside, the barn was warm by comparison, animal warmth, hay warmth, the smell of cattle and old wood. Ethan hung the lantern on its hook near the first stall and found an old wool blanket from the tack room, the kind they used when a calf was born in cold weather. He handed it to her without ceremony. She sat down in the hay in the corner away from the animals, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and was asleep in under 2 minutes. Ethan latched the barn doors against the storm. He looked at her for a moment. Young, mid-20s, maybe. No bag that he could see. No phone in her hand. She had come across his land in a blizzard on foot, and she hadn't explained a single thing about why. And she had fallen asleep in a stranger's barn, with the particular depth of someone who has been running too long. He went back to the house. He stood at the back door for a moment before going in, listening. The storm was still going. The barn stood solid in the dark, the lantern light leaking through the boards as a thin orange line at the base of the doors. He could hear the cattle. They were settled, which they wouldn't be if anything was wrong inside. He went into the kitchen, dried off his boots at the mat, and poured himself a glass of water at the sink. He stood there and drank it, and thought about what he'd just done. He had let a stranger into his barn, a young woman he knew nothing about. She had given him a name, Ava Sinclair, and a very small amount of information, which was no information at all, really. She could be anything. She could be running from something of her own making. She could be dangerous in ways that didn't announce themselves. He thought about these things in the way he thought about most things, methodically, without panic, turning each possibility over and examining it. And when he was done examining, what he came back to was the same thing he'd come back to when he first saw her in the lantern light, pressed against the barn door in the blowing dark. She was not dangerous. He was certain of that. The way he was certain of weather and soil and the movement of his cattle. Some knowledge was not rational. It was built from years of reading the world accurately, and it was reliable in ways that explanation could not always follow. He did not sleep much that night. He sat in the kitchen chair by the window until nearly 2 in the morning, watching the barn, watching the lane. No headlights came up the road, no sound that didn't belong to the storm. Whatever she was running from, it hadn't found her yet. He said a quiet thing under his breath that was close to a prayer but wasn't quite, and finally went upstairs. The storm broke before dawn. Ethan was up at 5, the way he always was. He made eggs, toast, and coffee enough for 2, and carried a plate out to the barn when Lily was still asleep. He moved quietly, setting the plate and the mug on the hay bale nearest to where the young woman had been the night before. She was awake. She was sitting up in the corner with the blanket still around her shoulders, watching him the way a person watches something they haven't decided to trust yet. Her eyes were dark brown, clear, despite everything. Whatever she'd been through, it hadn't touched her eyes. Ethan set the food down. "You don't have to eat it," he said. "But it's there." He went to check on his cattle. Fed them. Cleaned the nearest stall. He kept his back to her and gave her room, the same way you give room to a horse that's been spooked. After a while, he heard the sound of fork against plate, and then the slow sound of someone drinking something hot. "What's your name?" she asked. "Ethan Cole." He didn't look up from what he was doing. "This is my farm." "A pause." "Ava," she said. "Ava Sinclair." He nodded like that, settled something. "You warm enough?" "Yes." Another pause. Longer. "Why are you helping me?" He thought about it. He wasn't a man who used words to fill space, so he waited until he had the right ones. "Just felt right," he said. She didn't respond to that. He didn't need her to. When he went back inside to get Lily up and ready for school, Ava was still in the corner of the barn, both hands around the empty coffee mug, staring at something he couldn't see. He left her alone. When he came back out an hour later to check on the cattle again, she was still there. He watched her without making it obvious. She had a stillness about her that struck him as unusual, not the stillness of a calm person, but the stillness of someone who had trained themselves not to move too much, not to take up too much space, not to give anything away. He recognized it the way you recognize a scar on someone's wrist. You see it and you don't mention it, but you file it carefully. She positioned herself, he noticed, so that her back was never fully to an open space. Always with the wall behind her. Always angled toward the door. He'd seen that in horses that had been badly startled the way they moved through a space with one eye always on the exit. She stayed through the afternoon. He brought her lunch soup in a thermos, more bread. She accepted it this time without the hesitation of the morning. By evening, when he told her there was a spare cot in the storage room off the barn if she wanted something better than the hay, she said yes. Lily saw her at dinner time, coming in from the barn when Ava stepped outside to wash her hands at the outside spigot. His daughter was 6 and thought the world was made of opportunities to be curious. "Are you staying with us?" Lily asked. "For a little while," Ava said. She looked at Ethan quickly, checking, and he gave a small nod. "Good," Lily said. "We have extra blankets." That night, Ava sat at the kitchen table while Lily colored at the other end, and Ethan made dinner on the stove, and nobody said much, but the silence had changed its shape. It wasn't the silence of someone who had stopped expecting good things. It was starting to become something closer to ordinary quiet. After Lily was in bed, Ava carried her own plate to the sink and washed it without being asked. "I'll leave tomorrow," she said, with her back still to him. "I don't want to cause you trouble." "You're not causing trouble," Ethan said. She dried the plate and set it in the rack. She still wouldn't look at him. "You don't know that yet," she said. He turned off the kitchen light. Then, we'll find out tomorrow. On the third morning, the snow was old and packed, and the sky had gone the bright, brutal blue of a Montana winter without clouds. Ethan was out near the fence line when he saw it. A black SUV moving slow on the county road that ran along the south edge of his property. Moving too slow for someone just passing through. He watched it from the fence, still holding his wire cutters, not moving. The SUV stopped. Two men got out, both dressed too dark and too clean for this kind of country, and they came across the snow toward him. He stood where he was. The taller one held up a photograph. Ava's face, looking. "You seen this woman?" the man asked. Ethan looked at the photo for a long moment. Then he looked at the two men. He read them the way you read weather, the set of their jaws, the way they held their bodies, the fact that neither one of them had introduced themselves. "Can't say I have," he said. "She might have come through here last few days." "On foot. Lot of ground out here," Ethan said. "People don't walk through in December." The second man looked at the barn. Ethan kept his face still, and his eyes on the first man. "You sure?" "I'm sure," he said. They held the look for a beat that lasted longer than it should have. Then the first man put the photograph away and said something to the second, too low to catch, and they turned and walked back through the snow to the SUV. Ethan watched them until the vehicle was back on the road and moving. He walked to the barn. Ava was already pressed against the far wall in the shadow behind the cattle stalls, her arms tight around herself, watching through the narrow gap between the boards. She'd heard the car. She'd seen the men. When she turned to look at him, the composure she'd been building over 3 days had come undone entirely. "Did they show you a picture?" she asked. "They did. What did you tell them?" "That I hadn't seen anyone." She closed her eyes. The breath that came out of her was long and shaking, like something she'd been holding too long. "They'll come back," she said. "They always come back." Ethan pulled a bale down from the stack and sat on it. "Who are they?" She opened her eyes and looked at him across the dim winter light of the barn. And whatever she'd been deciding since the first morning whether to tell him, whether to trust him, she decided it now. "If they find me," she said quietly, "I'm dead." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then you'd better tell me everything," he said. Her father's name had been Richard Sinclair, and he had built the Sinclair Group over 40 years into one of the largest privately held companies in the Pacific Northwest. Logistics, real estate, shipping contracts with 3 state governments. The kind of company that didn't put its name on buildings because it didn't need to. He had died in October. Heart failure, the death certificate said. Ava didn't believe the death certificate. She had been present in the days immediately after. She had seen the way Preston had moved through those days, the efficiency, the speed with which arrangements were made, the particular calm of a man who had been waiting. A man who grieved does not, in the first 72 hours, have his assistant courier documents to the company's board members. A man who grieved does not schedule calls with 3 of the company's largest outside investors before his brother's body is in the ground. She'd said these things to a lawyer. The lawyer had told her grief manifested differently in different people. She'd said these things to her father's oldest friend, a man named Walter Greer, who had known Richard Sinclair for 50 years. Walter had listened very carefully and said nothing at all, and the nothing he said told her everything. She had been her father's only child from his first marriage. His brother, her uncle, Preston Sinclair, had been with the company since the beginning. For decades they had worked in parallel, Richard at the top, Preston just below him, and the arrangement had held because Richard was alive and because his word was the final word. 2 weeks after Richard died, the board voted to accelerate the succession timeline. Preston moved fast. He had the votes. What he didn't have was Ava's cooperation. Because Ava controlled a 34% stake in the company through a trust her father had structured specifically to prevent any single faction from consolidating power. So Preston had sent lawyers first, then accountants, then men in dark suits who weren't lawyers or accountants. Ava had understood what was happening. She'd packed 2 bags, wired a portion of her own accessible cash to a private account, and walked out of her apartment in Seattle on a Tuesday night without her phone or her car. She'd been moving since then. 3 weeks, 6 cities, 2 state lines. She'd made it to eastern Montana on a bus, and then a series of rides with strangers. And then, Her last ride had dropped her 14 miles from Ethan's farm on the afternoon of the storm, and she'd walked the rest of the way in the dark, because there was nothing else left to do. Ethan listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, the barn was very quiet. One of the cattle shifted in its stall. The wind pushed against the south wall. He thought about what she'd just told him. He arranged it the way he arranged most information, not in terms of what it meant to him, or what it required of him, but simply what it was, what was actually in front of him. A young woman whose father had died under circumstances she had reason to distrust. A corporation worth a significant sum of money. A man, her uncle, who had moved efficiently and ruthlessly to secure that money. 4 men sent to a Montana farm to retrieve a woman who stood between that man and complete control. None of this was complicated. Underneath, it was old and simple and ugly in the way certain things were old and simple and ugly. Greed, and the willingness to harm people in the service of it. "You gave up your stake?" he asked. "No," she said. "That's the thing. My father structured the trust so I can't give it up. Not without a legal process that takes months. Preston knows that. That's why." She stopped. That's why lawyers weren't going to be enough. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "How much is the company worth?" She told him the figure. He didn't react to the number the way most people would have. He just absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, without drama, without the performance of shock. "You're safe here," he said. 3 words. She heard them, and something inside her that had been clenched for 3 weeks let go, just slightly, not because she believed they were guaranteed to be true, but because the man who said them sounded like someone who meant every syllable, and she hadn't heard that sound in a very long time. She looked at her hands. "You don't know what you're taking on," she said. "I know what I'm looking at," he said. "Someone who needs help." She tried to leave the next morning. He found her before sunrise in the storage room, her coat on, the blanket folded neatly on the cot. A note on top of it. He didn't read the note. He stood in the doorway and waited until she turned around. "It's not fair to you," she said. "Or Lily. Lily doesn't know what's happening," he said. "She will, if those men come back." "Let them come," he said. She looked at him steadily. The early dark was still behind the small window of the storage room, and the barn around them was just beginning to fill with the first pale light of a Montana winter morning. In that light, she looked less like someone who had given up, and more like someone trying to talk themselves back into giving up, which was a different thing entirely. "Ethan, it is now my problem," he said. "Whether you walk out that door or not, I've already lied to those men. That made it my problem the minute I said the words." He crossed his arms. "So you staying or going doesn't change my situation much. It only changes yours." She stared at him. "That is the most stubborn thing I've ever heard," she said. "Probably." She didn't leave. That night, after Lily was asleep, they sat on the porch together in the cold with the lantern between them. It wasn't warm enough to be comfortable, but neither of them mentioned it. The stars above eastern Montana in December were not something you could be indifferent to. They occupied the whole sky, like something biblical, too many and too bright. The kind of sky that made the concerns of human life feel briefly manageable, simply by virtue of being put into proportion. He'd lived here his whole adult life, and still had nights where he came outside and just stood for a while, not doing anything. His ex-wife had called it brooding. He didn't think of it that way. He thought of it as paying attention. Ava sat in the other chair with her knees pulled up, her coat wrapped tight, watching the same sky. She didn't seem to need him to say anything, which was a quality he valued more than he'd ever found a way to express. A vehicle moved on the county road, slow and dark, no headlights. Ethan watched it pass without moving. His hand was near the rifle he'd brought out and leaned against the porch rail. Ava watched it too. Her posture had changed the moment the dark shape appeared on the road, subtle, coiling inward, shoulders tightening. When it was gone, she let out a slow breath. "They're patient," she said. "They can afford to be. They think they have time. Do they?" He thought about it honestly. "Probably more than I'd like." She looked at him sideways. "That's not exactly reassuring." "No," he agreed. "But it's true." He paused. "I'd rather you know the truth than feel better for the wrong reasons." She considered that. "No one ever stood up for me like this," she said. He didn't say anything right away. He watched where the vehicle had disappeared into the dark. "You do now," he said. She looked at him. He looked at the road. Neither of them said anything more. And the silence was a different kind than the one from 3 days before. This one had weight and heat, and the particular quality of two people becoming real to each other in a way that had nothing to do with what either of them had owned or lost. They came in daylight this time, which was worse in a way. Daylight made them brazen. 2 SUVs, not one. They came up the county road and turned onto Ethan's access lane without slowing down, and they stopped 30 yards from the house. 4 men got out, the same 2 from before, and 2 Ethan hadn't seen. Ethan walked out to meet them. He had the rifle. He wasn't pointing it at anyone. He was carrying it the way a farmer carries a tool, because it belonged in his hand on his land. The tall one from before stepped forward. "Mr. Cole," he said, like knowing his name was supposed to mean something, "we have reason to believe you've been sheltering a woman named Ava Sinclair. We'd like to speak with her. Who do you work for?" Ethan asked. "That's not your concern. You're on my land," Ethan said. "Everything here is my concern." The man looked at the rifle, then at Ethan's face. He was calculating something. And whatever he was calculating, he didn't like the answer. "This isn't your business, Cole. This is my land," Ethan said. "You weren't invited. I'd like you to go. We're not leaving without the girl. Then we have a problem." He said it the way he said most things, flat, without theatrics, in the register of a man who has already worked through the situation and arrived at his position and sees no reason to apologize for it. The 4 men looked at each other. The tall one looked back at Ethan. "You understand what you're protecting," he said. "She is involved in a legal dispute with—" "Save it," Ethan said. "Legal disputes don't send 4 men to a Montana farm." Nobody moved. The wind came across the pasture and pushed loose snow off the fence posts. From inside the barn, he could hear Lily's voice. She'd been helping him feed the calf this morning. And she was still in there. And she didn't know any of this was happening, and he needed these men off his property before that changed. "Leave," he said. The tall man's jaw tightened. He took 1 step toward the house. Ethan raised the rifle, not at anyone, at the sky. But the action was clear and deliberate, and it made 3 of the 4 men stop moving immediately. "I'm not going to say it again," Ethan said. The 4 men exchanged a look. The tall one held the stare for another 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked back toward the SUVs, and the others followed. They didn't drive away. They pulled to the end of the lane and stopped. Ethan went into the barn. Ava was there, pale, her back against the stall wall. "They're not leaving," she said. "No," he agreed. Lily looked up from the calf she'd been brushing. "Daddy, who were those men?" "People who made a wrong turn," he said. He crouched down to her level. "I need you to go inside and stay in your room for a while. Can you do that for me?" She studied his face with the intensity that 6-year-olds use to read the truth beneath adult words. "Okay," she said. "But you have to come inside soon." "I will," he said. "I promise." He stood up and looked at Ava. "Then we make a stand," he said. Ethan's mind was a practical one. He did not think in terms of narratives or odds or emotional outcomes. He thought in terms of problems and the specific, concrete steps required to address them. This was not a deficiency of imagination. It was a competency that Montana winters and a farm on the edge of viability had built into him over 20 years. The problem. 4 men in 2 vehicles, parked at the end of his lane, waiting. What they wanted. Ava. What they would do to get it. Uncertain. But the fact of 4 men traveling together with no stated organizational affiliation suggested they were not operating within any framework that required restraint. Resources. 1 rifle. 1 shotgun in the house. Knowledge of every inch of his own land in the dark. He told Ava to get Lily from the house and take her to the root cellar beneath the old equipment shed. The cellar was thick-walled, below grade, and invisible from the lane. He gave Lily a flashlight and her stuffed rabbit. and told her it was an adventure, which she half believed and half didn't, but accepted because she trusted him. He put Ava's hand on her shoulder. "Stay with her," he said. "Whatever you hear, don't come out until I come for you." "Ethan, please," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. He locked the cellar door from the outside. Then he went to work. He had 4 things going for him. The dark, which was falling fast with the winter sun. His knowledge of the land. The fact that the men outside were dressed for city work, not Montana night. And the cattle. He opened the east gate of the main pasture, not wide open, just enough. The cattle would eventually drift toward the open space. They always did, in the dark and the cold, with headlights and unfamiliar sounds and movement. A small herd of confused cattle was better than any fence. He circled the barn from the north, coming at the back of it through the snow-covered equipment yard. From here, he could see the lane, and from the lane he could see him. So he moved low and slow, along the line of the old tractor shed, until he was behind the woodpile that sat 12 feet from the barn's west wall. The SUV's engines were still running. He could see the exhaust curling up in the cold. Then one of the doors opened. They'd decided to stop waiting. 2 of them came up the lane on foot. The other 2 stayed with the vehicles. Ethan tracked the 2 moving figures from behind the woodpile. They went to the barn first, pulled the door open, went inside. He heard them moving around in there, the cattle shifting, the thud of boots on boards. One of the men called something to the other. They came back out. They headed for the house. Ethan moved. He crossed from the woodpile to the barn's east wall, keeping the barn between himself and the 2 men, and came around the south corner to where the 2 SUVs sat on the lane with their engines running. The 2 men left behind were both in the lead vehicle. One was watching the house. The other had his phone out. Ethan crouched behind the second SUV. He pulled his knife from his belt and put it into the rear tire of the second vehicle. The hiss was quiet under the sound of the running engines. Then the front tire. He moved to the first vehicle harder now. The 2 men inside were only feet away, separated by glass and their own inattention, and did the rear tire before one of them started to get out. He was already back behind the barn before the door opened. From inside the house, glass broke. His jaw tightened. He heard a voice, one of the men inside, shouting something, and then another voice, harder and with an edge of violence that told him they hadn't found what they were looking for. He went in through the back kitchen door. The man in the kitchen heard him come through and turned. And Ethan hit him once. Hard. With the stock of the rifle, not the barrel, the stock across the forearm, when the man reached for something at his hip. The man went sideways into the counter, and Ethan had the thing at his hip before he could recover it. And then the other man came out of the hallway and stopped when he saw the rifle up and level. On the floor, Ethan said, "Both of you." The man from the hallway didn't move immediately. Ethan fired once into the kitchen ceiling. The sound in a closed room at night is enormous. Both men went to the floor. Outside, he heard shouting the men from the lane, coming at a run. He tied the 2 in the kitchen with electrical cord from the utility drawer, something he was able to do very fast because he'd spent a significant portion of his adult life dealing with things that needed to be secured in a hurry, which was the daily reality of working with large animals. Then he stepped out the back door and into the yard. The other 2 men were coming around the barn from the east. He was between them and the house. He raised the rifle. "Get off my land," he said. One of them pulled a weapon. Ethan put his shot into the snow 2 feet ahead of the man's boots, and the man stopped. They were calculating again. He was one man with a rifle who had just demonstrated he could shoot accurately in the dark, and their vehicles were sitting on 2 flat tires apiece, and somewhere in the house behind him were 2 of their associates who were no longer answering. The calculation didn't take long. They put their hands up. Ethan called the county sheriff's line at 10 past midnight. Sheriff Dale Harmon had been the law in this county for 16 years, and had a voice that sounded exactly like a man who'd been woken at midnight, deliberate and unhappy. But when Ethan explained what was in his kitchen, what was on his lane, the voice changed. "Don't let anyone move," Harmon said. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. He was there in 17. 3 patrol cars came up the county road. Ethan had the two men from the kitchen seated on the porch with their hands secured. The other two were standing at the lane with their backs to the barn wall, also secured. In a way that was workmanlike, if not precisely comfortable, Harmon walked the scene with the slow thoroughness of someone who intended to understand everything before he said anything. He was a big man, older, with a deputy's exactness about evidence and a sheriff's ease with confrontation. 4 men, he said to Ethan, when he'd walked the full circuit. 4, Ethan confirmed. Weapons, 3 between them. All in the truck with my deputy. They discharged none. You discharged one. Into the ceiling of my own house. Warning shot. Ethan paused. My daughter was in the root cellar with a guest. Harmon looked at him. A guest, he said. Ava Sinclair, Ethan said. The name meant something to Harmon. Ethan watched it register not recognition from personal knowledge, but recognition from something read, something in the news, something that had come through official channels. Come inside, Harmon said. They sat at the kitchen table under the overhead light with the hole in the ceiling and the broken glass from the hallway window swept into the corner. Ava came up from the root cellar with Lily, who had fallen asleep down there, and was carried up against Ethan's shoulder still clutching the rabbit. After Lily was back in bed, Ava sat across from Harmon and told him the same story she'd told Ethan, all of it. Without editing, with dates and names and the specific sequence of events that had led her to eastern Montana on foot in a December blizzard. Harmon listened with his notepad out, but rarely wrote in it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Preston Sinclair, he said. My uncle, she said. Yes, I'm going to make some calls in the morning, he said. State police. And some calls to Seattle. This will take a few days to move through the right channels. He looked at her, steadily. Can you sit tight for a few days? She looked at Ethan. Yes, she said. Harmon's men took the 4 men away. 2 of them gave names. The other 2 refused. It didn't particularly matter, they had identification on them regardless. And the chain of employment wasn't going to take long to follow. When the patrol cars were gone and the lane was empty and the night was quiet again, Ethan sat down at the table with 2 mugs of coffee and pushed one across to Ava. She held it in both hands. We don't run anymore, she said. He looked at her over his mug. No, he said. We don't. Harmon moved faster than Ethan had expected. By the second morning, there were 2 deputies parked at the end of the lane. By the afternoon, a woman from the state attorney general's office had driven 3 hours to sit in Ethan's kitchen and ask Ava very precise questions about dates and financial documentation and the specific language of her father's trust. Ava answered everything without hesitation. 3 weeks of running had clarified her thinking entirely. The woman from the attorney general's office, compact, efficient, with a legal pad covered in very small handwriting, looked up at one point and said, You've thought through every element of this. I had a lot of time on buses, Ava said. Harmon came back on the 3rd day with a federal contact, a man from a financial crimes division whose jurisdiction, it turned out, was broad enough to include the kind of corporate coercion that Preston Sinclair had been conducting for the past several weeks. The 4 men from the farm had begun talking, as people in their situation tend to do when they understand the scope of what they're being connected to. The federal contact's name was Morrow. He was a quiet man, younger than Harmon, who listened more than he spoke and wrote almost nothing down but remembered everything. He sat across from Ava for 90 minutes at the kitchen table and asked questions that revealed, through their precision, that he already knew a substantial amount about the Sinclair Group's internal structure, about Preston's relationship with the board, about the trust and the specific language within it that created the obstacle Preston could not legally remove. Your father was careful, Morrow said at one point. He was afraid of exactly this, Ava said. Not of Preston specifically. Of the possibility. He understood that the company was big enough to attract the kind of behavior that turns family into something else. She paused. He told me once that the trust wasn't about money. It was about making sure that if anyone ever tried to move too fast, they'd be forced to slow down long enough for the right people to notice. Morrow looked at her. He was right, he said simply. The net was closing from multiple directions. On the 4th morning, Harmon called Ethan's cell. "We're going to bring him in today," he said. "I thought you'd want to know. You need anything from us? Stay put. Keep the line open." Ethan relayed this to Ava over breakfast. She was sitting at the table with Lily, helping her with the workbook pages her teacher sent home before school break. Lily had accepted Ava's presence in the house with the complete, uncomplicated openness of a 6-year-old who judged people primarily by whether they were kind and whether they were interested in the things she was interested in. Ava had passed both tests in the first 48 hours. Ava looked up from the workbook. "Today," she said. "That's what he said." She looked back down at the page. Her hand, Ethan noticed, had gone very still on the table. The call came at 4 in the afternoon. Harmon's voice was flat and professional. The voice of a man reporting a fact. "Preston Sinclair was taken into custody in Seattle this morning. The other two, the ones who hired the men who came to your place, are in state custody in Spokane. Financial Crimes has opened a formal investigation into the trust manipulation. It's going to be a long process." A pause. "But she's safe. Whatever else happens, the immediate threat is gone." Ethan stood by the window with the phone in his hand for a moment after the call ended. Outside, Lily was in the snow near the barn, building something, a snow animal of uncertain species, ambitious and structurally unsound. He turned around. Ava was standing in the kitchen doorway. She'd heard his side of the call. "It's over," he said. She leaned her shoulder against the doorframe. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She just stood there and breathed, long and slow, like someone letting a weight down that they'd been holding so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to set it on the ground. "It's over," she said. Outside, Lily called for help with the snow animal. They both went. 3 days passed. The sky stayed clear and cold. The snow settled into the steady crust of late December, glittering under a sun that gave light without warmth. The farm returned to its rhythms. The cattle needed tending. The fences needed checking. There was wood to be split and stacked, equipment to be winterized, all the ordinary, insistent work of a place that didn't stop requiring attention just because extraordinary things had happened in it. Ava worked alongside Ethan for all 3 days. She carried hay. She learned how to break ice from the water troughs, which required a specific technique and a certain unhesitating force she developed within the first morning. She figured out, on her own, how to operate the tractor that moved the feed barrels from the equipment shed to the barn, which took her about 40 minutes longer than it should have, and resulted in one minor collision with a fence post that she told Ethan about immediately and without being asked. She played with Lily in the afternoons. They built 4 snow animals. One was definitively a horse. The other 3 were up for interpretation. On the evening of the 3rd day, Ava's contact at her father's law firm called. The man had been trying to reach her for days and had eventually gotten her number through Harmon's office. He spoke for 30 minutes. She sat at the kitchen table and listened, asking few questions. When she hung up, Ethan was in the next room but made no pretense of not having been close enough to hear. She sat for a while after the call. Then she came and stood at the doorway of the living room where he was reading in the chair nearest the fire, which was where he always sat in winter evenings. "The trust is intact," she said. "The board voted to suspend Preston's board seat pending the investigation. There are decisions that need to be made." She paused. "I'll need to go to Seattle eventually." "I know," he said. "The company it's complicated. There's a lot that has to happen. I imagine." She leaned against the doorframe. He looked up from his book but didn't close it. "I don't want to go back to it," she said. "To the way it was before." She thought about it. "My father spent 40 years building that company and never once had a morning like the ones I've had this week." She looked at the fire. Feeding cattle in the snow, helping a 6-year-old build a thing that was supposed to be a bear. "It might have been a bear," Ethan said. "Parts of it." She smiled. It was small and real. She came and sat in the other chair. "Not the way guests sit, the way people sit when they've decided a room belongs to them too. At least for this moment." They sat by the fire without speaking. The only sounds were the fire and, outside, the wind moving across the field that was quiet now. holding its snow the way the valley always did in the deep part of winter, a vast, still white that went to the tree line and beyond, all the way to the mountains you couldn't see in the dark but knew were there. He thought about what his life had looked like a week ago. The same chairs, the same fire, the same window with the same dark outside. He had been content with it genuinely, not merely resigned. He had built this life from specific choices after his marriage ended, and he had made his peace with its particular shape. Small, self-reliant, shaped around Lily's needs and the farm's rhythms, and the quiet that came from not needing anything from anyone. He was not sure, sitting in this chair now, that the shape was going to be exactly the same going forward. He wasn't sure he minded. He thought about Lily. She had taken to Ava the way she took to everything she found genuinely interesting, completely, without reservation, with the open trust that children have before the world teaches them to hedge it. Lily was not indiscriminate. She had met plenty of adults over her 6 years, who she had assessed quietly and then simply withdrawn from, without drama or explanation, in the way children withdraw from things that don't feel right. When she chose to give her full attention to someone, she was reading something correctly. He trusted that. "The barn's too small," Ethan said eventually. She looked at him. "If you were going to stay," he said, "you'd want a proper room. The house has the room off the back that I use for storage. It's not much, but we could build something bigger," she said. He looked at her. "The storage room's fine for now," she said. But eventually, she looked at the fire. A person could put up a proper addition if they planned ahead, if they had time and reason to. She was quiet for a moment. "I've built things before, not with my hands, but I know how projects work, how to plan them, how to see them through." "I imagine you do," he said. "I'm serious," she said. "Not about the company. I mean..." She shifted in the chair, looked at him directly. "I'm good at seeing what something could become. I've been doing it since I was 22, working for my father, sitting in rooms full of men who'd already decided what the ceiling was and trying to show them the ceiling was wrong." She paused. "I know what this farm could be." "It's already something," he said, mildly. "It's good," she said. "I'm saying it could be more. If you wanted it to be." Another pause. "If we wanted it to be..." The fire cracked. A log shifted. "That's a lot of work," he said. "I'm not afraid of work," she said. "I broke ice from 3 troughs this morning." "You did," he said. "And I fixed the latch on the east gate," she said. "The one that's been sticking. I used the pliers from the tack room and figured it out." He looked at her. "Why didn't you tell me? I wanted to see if you'd notice." He hadn't noticed. He made a note to notice more. Lily appeared in the hallway in her pajamas, rabbit under one arm, looking at them both with the expression she used when she woke in the night and needed reassuring that the world was still in order. "Is it still nighttime?" she asked. "Still nighttime," Ethan said. "Go back to bed." She padded across the room to Ava's chair and stopped. She looked up at her. "You're still here," Lily said. "I'm still here," Ava said. Lily considered this carefully. "Good," she said. Then she turned around and padded back to her room, and the door clicked shut, and the fire went on burning, and outside the snowfields of eastern Montana lay still and white and enormous under a sky full of stars that had nothing to do with any of the things that had happened in the past week. They were simply there, the way they were every night, patient and immense and indifferent to human trouble in a way that, if you let it, was more comforting than troubling. Ethan put another log on the fire. Ava folded her legs up in the chair the way she'd started to do in the evenings. The way you do in a chair when you're comfortable enough to stop sitting like a guest. The night settled around the farm like snow settling slowly, without sound, filling in all the empty places. She was not running anymore. Neither of them said it aloud. They didn't need to. Some things are known before they're spoken, and some things become true in the saying, and this one had already become the kind of true that doesn't need words because it is made of mornings and meals and small choices, and the particular courage of 2 people who have both, for different reasons, learn not to expect that life offers second chances, and who have discovered, in the specific cold clarity of a Montana December, that sometimes it does anyway. Outside, the snow held the fields. Inside, The fire burned low. The lantern was lit. The road outside was empty, and the fields were still. And somewhere in the root cellar beneath the equipment shed, the flashlight they'd left behind had finally run out of batteries, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was the fire, and the chairs, and the small sounds of a house at rest. What mattered was that, outside this window, there was land that asked to be worked every morning, and that work was honest, and that honest work was the best answer Ethan Cole had ever found to most of the questions life put to a person. Ava Sinclair had been running for 3 weeks. She had stopped. It was a beginning,